I'd like to welcome you to the second speaker series event for the academic year for the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. My name is Kenji Yoshino, and I'm the director of the center. I'd like to begin by thanking the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network for co-sponsoring this event. I'd also like to thank our law firm sponsors for their support of this series. Those sponsors are Cleary Gottlieb, Steen and Hamilton, Cravath, Swaine and Moore, Davis, Polk and Wardwell, DLA Piper, Latham and Watkins, Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton and Garrison, Sullivan and Cromwell, Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen and Katz, Weil, Gottschall and Manges, and White and Case. For this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guests, Professors John Sides and Michael Tesler. Professor Sides is an expert in political behavior in American and comparative politics at Vanderbilt University. He is co-author of The Gamble, Choice and Chance in the 2012 Election and Campaigns and Elections, Rules, Reality, Strategy, Choice. In addition to his books, Professor Sides has written for popular outlets such as 538, CNN, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times. He received his BA from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and his MA and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Before joining Vanderbilt, he taught at University of Texas, Austin, and George Washington University. Professor Sides is joined by Professor Michael Tesler. Michael Tesler is an associate professor of political science at UC Irvine. He is the author of Post-Racial or Most Racial, Race and Politics in the Obama Era, and co-author with David O. Sears of Obama's Race, the 2008 Election and the Dream of a Post-Racial America. Professor Tesler was recognized by Politico as one of the top 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics in 2016, and received the 2018 Emerging Scholar Award for the top scholar in the field within 10 years of his or her PhD from the Elections, Public Opinion, and Voting Behavior section of the American Political Science Association. Before arriving at UC Irvine, he earned a PhD in political science from UCLA in 2011 and was on the faculty at Brown University from 2011 to 2014. Most relevantly for this event, Professors Sides and Tesler co-authored the book Identity Crisis, the 2016 presidential campaign and the battle for the meaning of America with their colleague, Lynn Vavreck. Unfortunately, Professor Vavreck was unable to join us for this event. I'd also like to introduce David Glasgow, my center's executive director and an adjunct professor here at the law school, who will be speaking with Professors Sides and Tesler at this event. We've purchased some ebook copies of Professor Sides and Professor Tesler's book, Identity Crisis. Everyone in attendance today has been automatically entered into a raffle to receive a copy. You'll be notified after the event if you've been selected. Toward the end of today's program, we'll open up for Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can. With that, I'd like to invite David to kick off the conversation.
Thank you so much, Kenji, and it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, Professor Sides and Professor Tesler. And so I want to kind of start really broadly. I know that a lot of what's on people's minds right now is the 2020 election, but your book is focused on the 2016 election. And so I want to kind of start there because I think it informs the present. And so very sort of broadly and in a nutshell, why did Donald Trump win the 2016 presidential election?
Thank you very much, David and Kenji. Thank you for having us. And it's a pleasure for Michael and I to be here. That's a complicated question, of course, but I think one crucial part of the answer has to do with the way in which issues related to race and immigration mattered in 2016 in ways they didn't matter even in 2012 or 2008. So in short, the story goes like this. Part of what we have to explain is why Donald Trump won the Electoral College, even as he lost the popular vote. And one of the things that was true heading into the election is that there were a large number of white Obama voters who had beliefs on issues related to race and immigration that were not really in line with Obama's or with the Democratic parties. These were people who would say in surveys things like, they didn't support a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, or they thought that racial inequality was mostly due to Blacks not trying hard enough, rather than to structural forces like slavery or discrimination. So it's kind of surprising to think that there's a substantial number of white Obama voters that have those attitudes, right? But people don't line up their political attitudes perfectly with their vote choice. What helps them do that, though, is when the candidates talk about those issues. And so this is what distinguishes 2016 from 2012. Trump and Clinton, to an extent that wasn't true of Obama and Romney, talked a lot about issues related to race, policing, unconscious bias, immigration, Muslims traveling to this country, undocumented immigrants. And so if you're a voter, now you have information that helps you map your views on these issues differently to your choice for president than you did in the last election. So what we found is that a particularly important predictor of voters shifting from Obama to Trump is those issues, race and immigration. And why this was important for the Electoral College is that voters with those views are more prevalent in states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. These are where states have a larger number of white voters with less formal education. For example, those are the voters that are more likely to have these attitudes. So in a sense, Trump and Clinton helped activate these issues differently. That helped some voters shift. And that provides Trump with the margin of victory he needs in these crucial states. That's not 100% of the story of the election, of course, but that's, I think, a crucial point.
Can I add to that in terms of the ongoing trends? The way I like to always talk about it is that Obama and Trump simplify the politics of race, especially for people who don't pay that much attention. So one thing we know is that lower information voters tend to be lower educated. And I'm guessing anybody tuned into this webinar right now kind of takes it for granted that the Democratic Party for some time has been more liberal on race and ethnicity than Republicans. But if you were a low education voter, you didn't necessarily know that. And so from kind of 1988 to 2004, only about half of non-college whites could place the Democratic Party to the left of Republicans on issues of race and ethnicity. And what we see during Obama's presidency is huge knowledge gains in terms of knowing where the parties stand on race. And then Trump comes along and simplifies the politics even more. And why this matters is because lower educated whites tend to have a lot more conservative views about race, ethnicity, and Islam. But they didn't necessarily know how to map them onto politics. And so during the Obama presidency, we see a big erosion of, this predates Trump, and it's kind of almost linear in terms of the erosion of white non-college from the Democratic Party. And those voters then are really ripe. These kind of cross-pressured ex-Democrat Obama voters are so ripe for a candidate like Donald Trump to come and pick them off and move them to the column. And because, as John said, they are predominantly located in the upper Midwest. And so we have one graph, an identity crisis, that shows a really linear trend in terms of change in state vote based upon how many non-college whites are in that state. And so that is a big piece of the puzzle. And we talk about how the diploma divide is largely a race and ethnicity divide in terms of aptitudes. And that's what's leading to this historic divide between college whites and non-college whites.
And so you, one of the sort of big political debates that we've been having since 2016 is to what extent economic anxiety has played into Trump's support. And so I'm curious what your findings are there of like, to what extent it was economics or economic anxiety a factor?
We looked at that pretty extensively. And we asked people questions in surveys, things like, how concerned are you about your family's financial situation? How concerned are you that you might lose your job? How concerned are you that you might not be able to make a mortgage or rent payment or a healthcare payment? I mean, I would have thought, knowing nothing about the election, if you had said 2 years before, are these the questions that you think would tap the most important economic anxieties of Americans? You would say, yeah, that pretty much hits it. Those are the big ticket items. So, but when we kind of added those things up into a measure of economic anxiety, it had almost no correlation with how people voted either in 2012 or in 2016. It didn't account at all for the diploma divide that Michael described. What distinguishes white voters who have more or less formal education in terms of their voting behavior is not how much economic anxiety they have, but it has more to do with these attitudes related to race and immigration. So sort of a pure economic anxiety doesn't really matter. The more potent form of economic anxiety is what we call racialized economics. And that is a view that says essentially, I'm concerned that white people are not getting what they deserve because of special favors to non-white people. So a much better predictor of support for Trump is not whether you think you might lose your job or you're concerned about losing your job, but whether you're concerned that white people are losing out on jobs because employers have to give them to minorities as part of affirmative action programs. And this notion, permeates a lot of people's thinking, even when you get beyond surveys and you go out and talk to people. There, of course, a famous book by the sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land. And she goes down from her perch in Berkeley to rural Louisiana and spends a long time there talking to people. And she has this metaphor, right? If people seem to see themselves as like standing in line, to get somewhere, and they're looking ahead and they're seeing, that people are cutting in line. And who are those people, right? There are people like undocumented immigrants who won't wait, come into the country, people who, are benefiting from affirmative action or what have you. And so, from our standpoint, what's important about economic anxiety in terms of what makes it politically potent, I mean, it's not that economic anxiety doesn't exist. It's not that people's lives don't have their challenges and all that. But what makes it politically potent is when it's overlaid with this racialized view of group competition over scarce resources.
Okay. One of the things I also want to do again is go back in terms of where does this economic anxiety that seems so prevalent in 2016 come from? I mean, one thing that we show in chapter 2 is that if you look at the economic indicators in terms of consumer confidence, in terms of economic growth, obviously the stock market, the economy looks pretty nice in 2016 in terms of declining unemployment. So why does the message get flipped into, oh my God, the economy is terrible? Well, one of these reasons is racial and ethnic attitudes. And so before Obama, how you viewed the economy did not come down to your racial and ethnic attitudes. There was no correlation. But what we show is that, and this is panel data where we're able to track the same people over time, the people who change their views and think the economy is more negative, even in 2007 when we were already headed into recession, those tend to be your most racial, most economically anxious, and your most racially anxious. And the one that's doing the moving, the racial attitudes are moving the economic opinions. It's not the economic opinions that are moving the racial attitudes. Maybe I can show a screen too to show how this has changed in 2020. Let me see if I can get this going down. All right. So this one I want to show here too is that how you view the economy comes down in large part to your identities, your partisan identities, and your racial and ethnic identities. So this is a graph here of who says the economy is good. Obviously, the economy was a lot better in 2016 than it is now. But you got 10% of Republicans in 2016 saying the economy is good. And then all of a sudden, magically in a year, they all think it's good. Meanwhile, Democrats are moving off. But this is what I want to, and this has gone up even since June when we made this graph. This is where Republicans think the economy is right now. This is where the Republicans thought the economy was in 2016. You can't objectively look at economic indicators and think the economy was better right now than it was in 2016. And then also if we move on to this, and this gets in what John was talking about group grievance and who thinks group economics is against them. This is the share of whites who think that the economy was better this year than it was last year. Obviously, the economy was better in October 2019 than it is now. And most people do indeed say it's worse, especially the people who don't think whites are aggrieved. But as you go down along here to the most aggrieved whites, they actually are more likely to say the economy is better now than worse. And so a lot of our perceptions of the economy, who it's working for and who it's not, gets filtered through our identities. And because partisan identities are increasingly overlapping with racial and ethnic attitudes, that's how racialized economics gets voiced.
Great. So we've been talking a lot about racial and ethnic attitudes and religious attitudes as well. I'm curious about gender because Hillary was the first major female nominee. That was a salient issue for people in the election, and even in 2020 in the Democratic primary, there was a lot of reported anxiety among Democratic primary voters about the prospect of nominating another woman candidate because of the experience with Hillary. And so I'm just curious about, to what extent did either Hillary Clinton's gender or attitudes on gender issues factor at all in that election?
You want me to go?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is hard. And it's hard because a lot of the way that sexism plays out in politics is invisible and unquantifiable. You saw this in the debate last night in terms of how and not just gender in the debate last night, but intersectionality in the debate last night. The idea that Kamala Harris could not push back as hard despite the fact that she was being mansplained and run over by a white man. And so those type of constraints make it very difficult to quantify how gender is playing out. And so I do want to preface this with that. But even despite the fact that sexism in politics is very hard to quantifiable, it's hard to quantify, we do see some ways that played out both in the primaries and in the general. Hillary Clinton lost the 2020 election because of the gender gap. And so let me say that again. Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election because of the gender gap. And when you look at women voted for Hillary Clinton the same that they voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, more or less. We did have a record gender gap in 2016, though, and that's because men voted for Donald Trump at rates that we haven't seen since George H.W. Bush's landslide victory in 1988. And so that is part of it, that Hillary Clinton didn't get a boost from gender. And we also see this attitudinally. We do not see Hillary Clinton outperforming Barack Obama among people with the most liberal gender attitudes. We do see her taking a dip, underperforming among the most sexist. And so that's kind of where I see gender in 2016, is that Hillary Clinton didn't get any boost from her historic gender identity, but she did pay a price for it. And the irony this time around is that the gender gap is going to make Joe Biden president because he is going to win women by historic numbers.
Right, yeah, so to that point, I would like to sort of ask a little bit about Joe Biden and the 2020 election, because the gender issue, you know, his being a man is an obvious distinction versus 2016, but there are some similarities between them as candidates in that, you know, he's an establishment politician, he's very well known, they're both white, they're both of a similar age, and they're both kind of from a more, I guess, establishment wing of the party as opposed to a sort of the Bernie Sanders Democratic Socialist wing. And so how do you view Biden as a candidate stacked up against Hillary Clinton? You know, what strengths or weaknesses do you see him bringing in 2020?
I mean, one of the things that I think is the most important parallel between Clinton and Biden is that they have kind of a similar appeal to groups within the Democratic Party. Clinton's victory in 2016 was built on people who identified as Democrats, like as opposed to identifying as independents, and it was built on people who are African American. And basically the same thing was true for Biden. The reason he is able to, of course, come from behind and do so well on Super Tuesday is because he's racking up, right, healthy vote margins among African Americans who make up large fractions of Democratic primary voters in the South. So I think both Clinton and Biden, even though, right, they're white establishment candidates, are showing that there's no real way to get to, you know, the modern Democratic Party nomination unless you're building a multiracial coalition. Obama was able to do that. Clinton did it. And now Biden's done it. So I think that is probably the most crucial thing. The other main difference between them, to be honest with you, has very little to do with them and everything to do with what it means to run as a candidate in an open seat election versus what it means to run against an incumbent president. There is a vast amount of messaging that is available to Biden, right, that was not available to Clinton. Clinton was in essence defending the incumbent party and the incumbent party's record, linking herself to that president. And Biden gets to run against the incumbent party. And he gets to make a set of claims that Clinton really couldn't make. He gets to say, under this president, the economy's worse. 200,000 people have died of the coronavirus, et cetera, et cetera. So a very political sciencey way to answer your question is not so much to drill down into the specifics of the individual people, but to talk about the way in which the circumstances that they find themselves in, right, give them opportunities or constraints, right, relative to other election years. And I think that's one of the things that's helped Biden to a significant extent. The other thing that I think mattered a great deal is that I think that the Democratic Party learned another lesson from 2016, which is there's a real danger to having this extended divisive primary and struggling to find ways to coalesce around the candidate. You know, it's hard to say how many votes Clinton won or lost as a consequence of that in 2016, but you can see that the party, right, consolidated more quickly. Sanders, you know, was willing to stand alongside Biden much earlier than he was willing to do so for Hillary Clinton. And so to some extent, I think the other thing that distinguishes the 2 years is not just Biden and Clinton, but it's really where the party is in terms of realizing the need for unity. And also feeling, I think, again, this is connected to having an incumbent like Trump, that sense of alarm, right, that Trump has created as president for many Democrats.
Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
I was going to go second John's political science-y, because that's 100% right, but I was also going to bring it back to identity. And as John said, you know, there's a reason why two-term open seat elections, after you're running for your party's third consecutive year, start off with about a 4-point disadvantage. It is a tough task to win a third consecutive term. And part of this, as John said, is messaging. If our colleague Lynn Vavreck was here, her first book is called The Message Matters. And one of the things you can see from her book is that the people who most effectively message tend to be candidates who run after a long period of control by the other party. So Kennedy in 1960, and Nixon in 1968, and Bush in 2000, and I would argue Trump in 2016. Because you have to defend, and Hillary Clinton talks about this in her memoirs, what a tough task that is to, if you take too much credit for going, for what's happening, then it looks like, oh, I'm taking credit for somebody else's work. If you try to distance yourself from that, oh, well, then I'm not loyal enough. So that's a real tall task to begin with. Also, in terms of the primary, this is one where COVID, and I also think Biden's existing relationship with Bernie helped a lot in terms of clearing the field. Because one of the things that we see over time is that Bernie supporters grow increasingly negative towards Clinton in May 2016, in June 2016, as a campaign that he had no realistic chance of winning drags on. And then finally, I want to bring it back to identity. In terms of one of the characteristics of our politics today is called affective polarization, meaning we increasingly dislike the other side. And what the research shows is a lot of what's driving the affective polarization is these identity issues. It is race, gender, culture. And so Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton kind of activate this in a way that nobody's scared of Joe Biden. And you even see that with the nickname, Sleepy Joe. Well, Sleepy sounds pretty good after 4 years of just mania. And so you see it at the rallies too. Does it hit on Sleepy Joe? Does it hit on Ilhan Omar? Lock her up, lock her up. And so that, being a 77-year-old moderate white man when most of the country is opposed to the incumbent presidency is really beneficial, because you're not going to scare anybody to think that Joe Biden is going to ruin the country in a way that Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Ilhan Omar, and should I say, the monster Kamala Harris, as Donald Trump called her this morning.
Right. So pivoting off of that, I'm curious, I'm going to ask a kind of counterintuitive question, which is how much do candidates really matter at the end of the day? I mean, one of the sort of findings that you discuss in the book is just how much the Republican Party coalesced behind Donald Trump. Even the people who were initially skeptical of him within the party coalesced. And, you know, even now when people are talking about a sort of potentially historic kind of landslide victory for Joe Biden, are still talking about maybe, you know, 10 points or something. And so I am just curious, like, are voters' partisan preferences now kind of so baked in that either party could pretty much put up anybody and they would likely perform relatively similarly to one another?
It would be, I think the way that I think about it is that stronger partisanship is putting a floor under candidate support, and it's putting a ceiling on candidate support. And it's just an increasingly narrow range between winning and losing. And I think that means that there's just a smaller number of voters who are persuadable or swing voters, and therefore would be influenced by things like who the candidate is and what they're like. And to some extent, you saw this with both Obama and Trump. And one of the ways that we document this in the book is we show that both Obama and Trump, their approval ratings didn't shift the way that you would have thought, given where the economy was. So Obama, you would have thought, okay, he's presided over this long economic recovery after the Great Recession. You know, certainly it was a halting recovery at times, but nevertheless, right, consumer confidence is restored as a consequence of this recovery, but Obama's approval rating doesn't change very much until maybe the last several months of his administration, when he finally gets a little bit of a bump. Similarly for Trump, he comes into office, the economy is doing very well. It continues to do well for the first 3 years of his presidency, but he's historically unpopular for a president presiding over such a strong economy. And so part of what's happening, I think, for both presidents is that people's views of them are enough influenced by partisanship that there's not as much that objectively the state of the country can do to impact them. If there was something I would say that might be distinctive about, let's say, Trump as a president or as a candidate, it does appear to be the case that Trump is is even more unpopular, than he should be, given the state of the economy as up to the beginning of the pandemic. Even maybe less popular than Obama was, given similar kinds of similar levels of consumer confidence. So you could perhaps attribute that, right, to Trump's personal style, his behavior, right, his knack for courting controversy, for scandal, and so forth. But again, I mean, we're talking about a few percentage points, so that's consequential in a close election. There's no question. But again, it doesn't necessarily amount to a game changer. And believe me, I think there were a lot of people that thought that 2016 would be proof that, right, that there were just certain things a candidate couldn't say or do without suffering some kind of clear electoral penalty. When it wasn't clear that Trump suffered that kind of penalty, I think we have to, again, to revise downward our expectations about what candidates, right, can accomplish or fail to accomplish based on their own personal characteristics.
I just want to add on to the point about this polarization propping the floor up from Trump. Nate Silver had an analysis on Twitter the other day saying that if polarization was the same as it was, Joe Biden has about a 9 to 10 point lead and 538 average right now. If polarization was the same as it was in 1980 or 1932, kind of the two historic precedents for a one-term incumbent president getting slaughtered at the ballot, he'd be up about 20 points right now if polarization was that same level. And I completely buy that analysis, given everything that John said.
Yep.
So on the one hand, we have 10 points, and people might say that, oh, how could everything that's happening now and Biden still only be up by 10? 10 is almost an impossibly large number in this environment. If you would have told me in January 2016 that Joe Biden would have had a consistent 8-point lead for the last 5 months, I would have laughed in your face and thought you were the craziest person I'd ever talked to. And that kind of is because we are in kind of a 45-45 world. And then I do think events can happen to move around the other 10%, but that's where we are with polarization. And I do want to say that these identity issues that are baked into partisanship now, that keeps the ceilings and the floors even more at their levels.
Great. So I just want to remind everyone participating to please submit any questions that you have using the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll move to some of the kind of audience questions soon. In the meantime, I wanted to ask you about, one of the many sort of major events of this year and the impact that it might have had politically or not, which were the Black Lives Matter protests and the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so on. So could you speak to that a little bit? What impact have the protests over the summer had or not had on the dynamics of the 2020 election?
Michael, you want to start?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'll show another graph here. Oops. So this graph here shows, and this was August 2019, and this shows what Donald Trump's approval ratings were on a bunch of issues. As you can see, Trump, well before the Floyd protests, he's rated poorly on every issue except for the economy, basically. But one issue really stands out, and that is race relations. These polls were taken around the time of the El Paso massacre and Donald Trump telling the squad to go back home. So they might be a little inflated, but throughout the presidency, even in less kind of contentious times, we're seeing -20 to -30 approval ratings for Donald Trump on race relation. And why I say country thinks he's doing even worse on race, because he's only about 20 points underwater in terms of how he's handling COVID. So in terms of COVID or race relations, he's actually viewed worse on race relations. And when something like George Floyd comes along and the president responds the way he did, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and I'm going to clear Lafayette Square so I can do a photo op of me holding a Bible upside down. The country views you as a racial arsonist at a time when racial unity is very much needed. And so this is kind of the shifting playing field of identity issues from 2016 to 2020. The playing field in 2016 was ISIS terrorists and undocumented immigrants being treated better than veterans. That's a very pro-Trump playing field. When the playing field shifts to, okay, African Americans are being systematically oppressed by the police, and we have video after video showing it, and who is best to unite the country's fractured race relations, that becomes devastating to Trump. And I don't think it's a surprise that we've seen kind of two shifts in the race. Kind of started off at a 4-point race, and then as it was clear in April, May that coronavirus was not going to magically disappear, we see it move to 6 and 7. And then in June, during the Floyd protests, we see it jump about another 2 points. And so the Floyd protests, and the other thing that the Floyd protests do is that they help shift racial attitudes so that there are fewer of these kind of cross-pressured Democrats to pick off. And this is kind of a picture here that we've seen throughout the Trump era. Democrats split on systematic racism. This is share of respondents who think white people have a better chance of getting ahead in society. We've seen huge shifts among Democrats towards thinking systematic racism in society, and especially policing, is a real and serious problem. And so that also means that race, which has historically been a great wedge issue to split the Democratic Party's more diverse coalition, which included white racial conservatives, African Americans, white racial liberals. And if we look at some of these issues here, and we see where the 50-50 line is, there's a problem with systematic racism in America, where Democrats are almost entirely united, and it's the Republicans who are divided. When the playing field is shifted in this way, you could very easily make the argument that race and identity are benefiting the Democrats in 2016. Sorry, 2020. I keep getting my years mixed up.
Yeah, so
stop sharing.
off of that, I actually do, there's a question from someone in the audience that sort of riffs off of that theme, which is, do you think that there's a danger in the Democratic Party focusing too much on the issue of race relations? I think this sort of gets at a lot of the debate around so-called identity politics and, to what extent an election focused on issues of race and other aspects of identity inherently favors kind of right-wing politics in some way. And so I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Do you mind if I take, John?
Go.
But, basically what I would say there is it depends on which issues the Democrats are pushing. Historically, there have been two types of racial issues pushed for: equality of opportunity issues and equality of outcome positions. When there is a historic movement for equality of opportunity or equal treatment, meaning, hey, maybe the police should treat you the same regardless of your race, ethnicity, or gender. Maybe everybody should have the same access to vote regardless of where you live or what your age is or what your color is. You can get majoritarian coalitions on board, and that's where the playing field seems to be. Once you shift from equality of opportunity or equal treatment issues to equality of outcome issues, things like affirmative action, or in a even more extreme case, reparations, then you're in trouble. And so one of the things we did see with reparations, there was no increased support for reparations during the Floyd. We saw big increases in beliefs about discrimination, in beliefs about the police, and beliefs about equal treatment during the Floyd protests. The opinions about affirmative action stayed flat. And this is also, Democrats, white Democrats have more liberal opinions about race than African Americans on a lot of questions now. The ones that they don't are reparations and affirmative action. Those are not things that even this woke, supposedly woke, white, liberal Democratic Party is still not behind. And so one of the ways I've heard it talked about is performative wokeness in terms of, but when it comes to moving the playing field from less symbolic issues or equal treatment to, all right, here's what we actually need to do to bring about systematic changes, then white Democrats lose and it becomes a difficult issue for Democrats.
And I think it's also worth flipping the question and thinking about the consequences of identity politics for the Republican Party. One of the real, I think, mistakes that commentators made after the 2016 election was to portray identity politics as if it's a uniquely liberal or democratic phenomenon and ignore its manifestations, which are, of course, as old as the country in some sense among politicians on the right as well. So, with regard to Trump, and one of the things that's also true about Trump is that, he has pursued policies like family separation that are also distinctively unpopular manifestations of identity politics. There is a broad, fairly bipartisan consensus on some kind of package of, path to citizenship, especially for Dreamers, couple that with some border security, and that basically works for a lot of voters. But that was never a package that Trump was particularly interested in, and the stuff that he did push, oftentimes met with majority disapproval, as well as, of course, outrage among a part of that majority. The other thing that I think is, Michael showed you that graph where the Democratic Party is shifting and the Republican Party, isn't. And I think that what that means, if you think about the public as a whole, right, is that the public as a whole is more liberal on racial issues than it was before Trump. And I wouldn't say that that is because of Trump in a simplistic way, but I think he is certainly one factor, right, that helps to create that. And so an open question, Adam Serwer, who's a writer for the Atlantic Monthly, raised this in a piece a couple of weeks ago. He says, is this the first time we have an anti-racist majority in this country? And I'm probably not quite as confident in that, but nevertheless, I think it is true, right, that we have a very different set of racial attitudes, at least among the Democratic Party. They are diametrically opposed to what Trump has been pushing since birtherism, in the Obama years, and in addition to his own presidency. And so you might look at the net impact of this to be one that sort of suggests that liberal identity politics winds up in a stronger position in 2020 than it was in 2016, even though a lot of commentators told the Democratic Party to do the opposite. Now, I don't want to overstate the meaning of that, though. To the point about George Floyd, one of the things that happened after Floyd was, Michael pointed out, increasing support for Black Lives Matter, increasing, understanding that the reality of police violence against African Americans is a serious problem. You had, prominent Republicans tweeting their sort of support for Floyd, or their discomfort or condemnation of the actions of the Minnesota police officers involved in his killing. That didn't last very long. And especially when the protests started and Trump targeted the protesters, and a lot of the narrative shifted away from sympathy for Floyd, right, to condemnation of the protesters among a lot of different Republican politicians. And so as a consequence, the opinion trends among Republicans changed as well. And you went back to the more polarized opinions that you saw, in the graphs Michael showed you on the right-hand side of that slide. And as the politics of this play out further and further, and you see local politicians, even in strongly Democratic areas like Minneapolis, struggling, right, to achieve real policy gains that would actually change police practices. That just goes to show that, I think that even if public opinion as a whole has moved in favor of progressive identity politics, especially among Democrats, actually achieving policy goals, policy outcomes is pretty difficult, especially once the protests die down and the spotlight shifts. And there's not the same, I think, salience of these issues in news coverage that there was in over the summer. So again, this is the same way it's true for all civil rights struggles, right? It's never something that's going to be solved, in a period of months. It's going to be, a long, hard fight. And I think that's likely where we're heading, even with the Biden administration, even with maybe the Democrats having unified control of government, right? There's still a lot that has to be done to actually achieve real equality.
One of the reasons I'm optimistic about the ongoing trend of liberalization is because what we've seen and what we didn't see prior to Trump is really big generational divides opening in these racial attitudes. And so I'll put a shout out for a political science book called Racial Stasis that recently came out. And what it shows is that, we were in a racial attitude stasis where racial attitudes were incredibly stable from 1988 to 2012. And one of the reasons they were incredibly stable is because there wasn't that big of a gap between young whites and older whites in terms of their racial attitudes. Historically, a big way that racial attitudes liberalized, same as attitudes about same-sex marriage or marijuana or trans issues now, is that when you are socialized in your 18 to 29 impressionable years, you tend to form your attitudes based upon what the changing norms and what the changing movements and dialogue are at the time. And so you're having this young generation be imprinted in some very liberal attitudes due to BLM, due to backlash against Trump. And why that's important is because when your attitudes get formed 18 to 29, they tend to persist. And what will happen is that older Americans with more conservative views about race are going to die, and then they are going to be increasingly replaced in the electorate by younger Americans. It's called generational replacement, and it's been a huge reason for previous trends in liberalized racial attitudes. So I do think that, I'm also not optimistic about an anti-racist majority, but I do think that the general trend that we've seen, while it may stall without Trump in office, is likely to continue because of generational replacement.
So does that leads into another question that we have here about whether or not that generational replacement issue means that support for the Democratic Party is going to increase over time, or is that assumption flawed because as people age, they become more conservative on their racial and ethnic views?
I mean, there's not much evidence of a lot of conservative shifts as you get older. That's I think a pretty prominent conception, but I don't think the breadth of the research supports it. I mean, I've never been a big believer in sort of a demographics as destiny or an emerging Democratic majority. That was a book, of course, famously published in 2000, right before Bush was elected, and what we tend to see, I think, is a lot of sort of cyclical shifts in political power that don't appear to reflect some chronic advantage that the Democratic Party has, won on the basis of an increasingly diverse country. I mean, and I think part of what makes me uncertain about making that prediction would be, a lot of this is conditional on having the alignment of different demographic groups with a political party, stay the same. And then we just, increase the number of non-white people relative to the number of white people. And then that just sort of shifts things. So what we saw in 2016, right, was that you could, right, get some more votes out of certain parts of the white electorate and use that to benefit a Republican candidate. Now that's not going to last forever, right, in the sense that for the reasons that Michael was saying, but still don't discount that. And I don't think you can also discount the question of whether, for example, people of Hispanic or Latino ethnicity, remain as strongly Democratic as they are right now. We've already seen, it takes work for Biden to win those voters. The same thing is true among younger African-American voters who are not as strongly aligned with Biden. Now, maybe that'll come. We still have a month of campaigning left. But I don't think we can make predictions about the political complexion of the racial and ethnic groups in this country 20, 30, 40 years away with much confidence, even if we can make a prediction that the country will be less white with a pretty good degree of confidence.
So another question is around, a lot of our discussion has been fairly kind of favorable toward Biden's chances in 2020, but what are the scenarios you could imagine in which Trump could win this election?
I mean, realistically, Biden's margin now is large enough that even if we had polling errors of the magnitude that we did in 2016 in these crucial battleground states, he would likely still win the Electoral College. So what you really need for Trump to win, in terms of just actually getting more votes than Biden and winning the Electoral College, something has to change in the next, let's say I'm looking at the data on my computer, in the next 4 weeks, to make sure that like the race actually narrows. And Trump's running out of time to do that. There's just not much left, especially if he's not going to debate. So I don't think that it's going to take a pretty dramatic narrowing of the race for Trump to be within shouting distance of winning an Electoral College majority, even though he's likely to lose the popular vote no matter what. If you want to go into other scenarios, then you have to get into these kind of extra legal or scenarios where you have contestation about the outcome on a number of dimensions. And I don't have any way to make confident predictions about the likelihood of that happening. I mean, of course, Trump's going to complain if he loses. That will happen, but whether that actually manifests itself in efforts to try to change the outcome in terms of stopping vote counting or sending alternative slates of electors from certain states, all these scenarios that you've read about if you've been reading these scary stories in the Atlantic and elsewhere. I don't know how to game those scenarios out and attach probability to them. I will say this, that the more conclusive Trump's loss, the larger Biden's victory, especially if that's visible on election night. I mean, the open question for me is not so much whether Trump complains, but whether others in the party are really willing to carry water. Or are they actually willing to sort of let him tweet, but basically live with the outcome, live with the loss. If they're willing to ally themselves with him and fight it, every step of the way, then yeah, I think we're in uncharted territory.
So I'll add in, my wife yells at me when I talk like this, so, but I really do think that the path has closed on a comeback. And let me show another graph. So this is my 2016, it's not 2020. It's actually G. Elliott Morris's graph, not mine. So I'll do a shout out to him. In terms of what this election looks like, and if we extended this back beyond 150 days, this kind of dips and dives in 2016 was very typical. And the way we kind of thought about this, John Lynn and I, was the race wanted to be close based upon the fundamentals in 2016, but Trump wouldn't let it. And so when Hillary Clinton is in the news, this here is the RNC, and it's also a lead up to Comey's first announcement, the race gets tight. But when Trump is doing crazy things, this here is when he goes on tilt after the Democratic National Convention and starts attacking the cons. This is this run up here is after the first debate. He starts attacking Alicia Machado, and then here is Access Hollywood. Note that even Access Hollywood is not as big as Biden's consistent lead. Biden's lead is consistent, and also Trump will not stay out of the news. So one of the stories we like to tell, John Lynn and I, is when the Comey letter comes out on October 28th. And there's a great Maggie Haberman piece about Kushner, Bannon, and Trump kind of delaying what they're going to do. And what they decided was the smartest thing Trump has ever done politically, and that was just to shut up and be out of the news. And I thought maybe when he got COVID, it might work to his advantage because he would shut up and be out of the news and people might be more sympathetic to him because he's a sick man. No. So the fact that he can't get out of the news, the fact that they were pretty proud of the debate that Pence put in last night. And then what does Trump do? He calls up Maria Bartiromo and completely steps all over that and makes news because he's negative. That's a big problem. And I don't see any way Trump gets out of the news. The other thing is that you're dealing with two historically unpopular candidates in 2016, and Donald Trump crushes among the double negatives, people who have negative views of Clinton and Trump. Not only is Biden approaching a positive favorability, I think he actually has got up to the positive numbers right now, but the double negatives who are left are breaking decisively for Biden. And so given kind of the stability of the race, the fact that all of the focus the next 30 days is going to be, when was your last negative test? How, and you're going to see drip, drip, drip of stories about the potential of Trump being a super spreader himself. And the more that they try to cover up and control the narrative, what we know about media politics is the more the media is going to push back. What's the positive story that Donald Trump gets the next 4 weeks? Now, he doesn't just need positive stories for him. He needs to drag Biden down. And Biden's running a very vanilla, I'm the guy to unite the country type of message. And so, you know, I don't want to say because my wife freaks out. She's scared of prosperity, but I don't see a path to come back.
So we've only got a few minutes left, so this might end up being the last question from the audience, which is polarization and the role of race here to stay? So more broadly, I guess, are the dynamics you talk about in the book of, you know, negative partisanship and deep identity conflicts here to stay, or do you see a pathway out of that?
I mean, you go, Michael.
Yeah, I've been talking about this for a long time, and I always punt and give unsatisfying answers. And my co-author, David Sears, on our first book on Obama, wanted to get out ahead and say, no, race is always the most important issue in American politics, and anybody who doesn't say so is crazy. And I was like, yo, chill, David. That might be a little, but the way the parties are set up now in terms of primaries, also important is that Republicans don't necessarily need to moderate on race and will still be fine politically. Republicans have an enormous advantage in the Senate. Republicans are about to have an enormous advantage in the Supreme Court. And as John talked about, presidential elections, even if you have somewhat of a structural advantage, are very cyclical depending on the nature of the times. So given where the Democratic Party is and given where the Republican Party's base is, the reason Donald Trump became the presidential nominee is because he was able to go and meet the voters where they were in terms of race, ethnicity, and Islam in a way that establishment Republicans in 2016 couldn't do, because that's not where the Koch brothers want the party to be. The Koch brothers want the party to be tax and deregulation and don't necessarily want this ethnocentrism. But that's where the Republican base is. And if you're going to win primaries in a Republican Party, I don't see them moderating too much on the issue. And then that leaves us in a world where, yes, we are here in this polarization. John may differ, though.
No, I don't think I do. I mean, I think both parties have incentives to kind of stay where they are. I mean, the Democrats, you know, even early on in the primary when they were, of course, there were plenty of pundits wanting to tell them to moderate on racial issues. You know, you ended up with primary candidates endorsing reparations, I mean, in debates. And so I don't think the Democratic Party is gonna shift. I think that in the killing of Floyd and Breonna Taylor has only made that even more likely. There's also, I think, a pretty strong perception that the party has to stake out an agenda that is very much the opposite of Trump's on these kinds of issues. So that, to me, is the direction the Democratic Party is likely to take. The Republican Party, I mean, I do remember not that long ago when there were Republican senators willing to vote for immigration reform in 2013. And when candidates like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio did think that they could do well being more moderate voices on those issues compared to Trump and Ted Cruz and others. My concern, I think, about the consequence of the Trump administration is not necessarily that he's changed the views of the base. I mean, I think there are always those voters in the party. The question is, are the moderate voices in the party now essentially, right, shifted to the margins? And so, even without Trump in office, are there Republicans who are willing to speak up in favor of immigration reform, let's say? And if they did so, what would happen? What's Tucker Carlson going to say that night? What's Trump going to tweet? Because of course he'll still be tweeting, I presume, right? So I do fear that what used to be a factional battle within the Republican Party about how moderate to be on racial issues has been to some extent resolved by Trump's victory. And by, I think, the concern among the more moderate voices that there's just not a huge upside to sticking your neck out and taking these positions. I could be proven wrong. I mean, I think I posed this question once to a non-Trump aligned conservative pundit and said, what would change things? And he said, losing. And but again, even in loss, right? Losses are just opportunities for parties to contest the meaning of loss. And there are going to be people who are going to say that, the problem for the Republican Party is A, B, C, D, E, and none of those things have to do with its racial politics. Mm-hmm. So it's really an open question to me whether there's an appetite in either party for moderating on race, to say nothing of whether there's an appetite in the Republican Party, right, for an agenda that looks more like racial justice.
All right, well, on that note, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone who attended today and for your excellent questions. And I particularly want to thank the both of you, Professor Sides, Professor Tesler, for enlightening us on the election. Thank you again.
Thanks so much for having us.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.